something small can actually end up being magnified when you don't protect your intellectual property, you put in your work, your creativity, and suddenly you're not profiting from it. Now, a lot of artists aren't in it for the money, but still, if you're going to put in the work, you should be paid. That's
Welcome to Techful Founder Podcast. I'm your host, Panita, and today we're diving deep into the intersection of AI and intellectual property with a distinguished advocate for Detroit's community, Eric C. Williams. As the managing director of the economic equity practice at the Detroit Justice Center and the founder and CEO of a boutique law firm catering to Detroit's vibrant entrepreneurial spirit, Eric is at the forefront of reshaping legal norms. With impressive roles for top-tier New York law firms, a compelling voice in surveillance technology ethics, and an educational background from renowned institutions like Columbia Law School and Cambridge University, Eric brings an unparalleled expertise to our table, whether you're an entrepreneur, a creative, or someone intrigued by the AI IP nexus. This episode promises deep insights and actionable advice. Stay with us as we navigate these uncharted waters with Eric C. Williams right here on Technical Founder. So, can you share with us your background and the pivotal experiences that influenced your career path? From your education at Columbia Law School to your role at prestigious law firms and your involvement in community development.
sure. So I guess the easiest way to begin is that I went to law school actually wanting to be a public defender. That's actually what I wanted to do. And the salary was just so low. It wasn't a viable option, to be perfectly honest. In New York, and so large law firms, when I was coming out of Columbia, were offering literally three times the starting salary. So my wife and my children would rather that I actually be able to feed them. So I decided to take that job. And what I found out was that I absolutely hated it. I didn't like working at a large law firm, but it was serendipitous that I ended up doing what I do now because I had a friend who ran a nonprofit art collective, and they needed some help working with protecting the intellectual property of the artists who were involved in this. So just as a helping out a friend, I started working with them. And what I discovered was that I really liked working with artists. It was it was fun. I enjoyed the subject matter. So I started doing that. And over the years, I just always did that on the side. And a number of years ago, after working in New York for a very long time, I moved back to Detroit to take a job teaching at Wayne State University Law School, which is located in downtown Detroit. And I was teaching students how to work with startups and entrepreneurs. And so my own practice, which I had continued this entire time, really took on a focus. And that sort of became primarily what I did, working with creatives, entrepreneurs, small businesses. And it was fun. And as I said, it was just serendipitous, right? But that's how life works. You end up doing something you never planned on doing. Hey, it works. I enjoy it. So that's how I ended up here.
That's a really great story. I think it just shows you that if you follow something you're passionate about and by helping people, you end up doing things that are beyond something that you would think you would be doing. And I really love how you help your friend, your creative friend, because I think intellectual property is something that not a lot of creators and artists focus on. And I think, yeah, it's a big issue. And
Yeah,
yeah, because everyone works really hard. And I think having lawyers have their back is really important.
it is. And it's unfortunate that too many times people think of lawyers as the enemy, but the truth is, couldn't be further from the truth. In most instances, right? Well, at least in all instances, your lawyer should be your best friend, the one person you can rely upon. It's funny to see how something small can actually end up being magnified when you don't protect your intellectual property, you put in your work, your creativity, and suddenly you're not profiting from it. Now, a lot of artists aren't in it for the money, but still, if you're going to put in the work, you should be paid. That's how the system works.
Definitely. So now let's delve into the topic of AI and intellectual property. Can you start by explaining the role of AI in the world of trademarks and intellectual property and why it's becoming increasingly important for entrepreneurs and creatives?
And if you'll pardon me, I'm having some technical issues, so we're going to move my
Sorry.
camera. So well, I'm sure you're familiar. So for one of the things that we really found out is that AI has capabilities we just never anticipated, right? And the jump has been really fast and really far. So when it comes to so there are a number of different kinds of intellectual property, but when you're talking about, for example, creatives, primarily what you're talking about is uh, primarily copyright, right? Which is your right basically to ownership of your creative output that's put in a tangible, from a tangible format, right? One of the dangers for creatives is that their intellectual property, their creative output will be used and will be impacted by AI in one of two ways. Either it's used to train AI, right? Which mean that, for example, you go to Chat GTP and you say, write a description of a love scene in the style of Octavia Butler or something like that. So it's able to do that because all the writings of Octavia Butler have been basically plugged into the training data. The second thing is the output, and that is the output can mimic very closely something that a creative made. And then I guess there's a third way, which is you use, and this applies to actors, and that is you can actually use their facial features. And actors have many times become famous because they have distinctive facial features. And you basically create a fake them, an AI version of them, and then you suddenly don't need the actor, right? So AI plays into a lot of different aspects of what creatives do. And unless they're very diligent about protecting themselves, they're going to get screwed. And this is why, for example, you had both the actors and screenwriters go on strike, and AI was a prominent issue in both instances. The producers obviously wanted to be able to use AI to create product, and the actors and writers were like, "You shouldn't be using our creativity without paying us." And so they finally reached a settlement that addresses some of this, but there are a lot of loopholes. And I think you're going to see that we're going to be revisiting this issue fairly soon.
Definitely. I think this is something that's really important because, well, actors, I just feel like back in the day, like you had to have like proper acting skills and all these things, but now you can just use AI to enhance whatever you have, or you need to have like proper writing skills. Like you need to learn how to write, but now you don't, and you can just mimic other people, which is all right if it's not like a specific person who is still alive. Because I feel like if you're mimicking someone who has been long gone, right? Correct me if I'm wrong. Like Shakespeare, like you can use that and publish it somewhere, and that is okay. But if it's someone who like should be getting the rights to that intellectual property, then that would be an issue.
And you picked a good example, and you can use Shakespeare or E.B. White, the guy who did Winnie the Pooh. They're long dead, and the copyright on their work is expired. For example, when at one point Apple introduced um, basically the books on Apple Books on on their hardware, they included Winnie the Pooh, but that's because they were able to do that because it was cheap because the copyright had expired. But copyright actually lasts beyond the author's lifetime. So their estate is entitled to, for a period of time, is entitled to compensation as well. So you're right. Long dead, yes. Recently dead, not so much, because their estate is still entitled to recover whatever payments will be due.
It's very
It's
interesting to know.
mhm. So hold on. It's early morning here in Detroit, and I'm only on this is only my third cup of coffee, so I'm a little underfueled.
Third cup. Wow, that's really early for 3 cups of coffee.
I work a lot.
So, what
Organized.
are some key benefits that AI brings to artists, writers, and musicians when it comes to protecting their intellectual property?
So I don't know. So if you're talking about protecting intellectual property, one of the good things is you can search to make sure that other people aren't using your intellectual property in a way that you really couldn't do before. The whole idea behind AI is that partly that it can mimic human thought, but mostly it can analyze data that's massive that human beings could certainly never do. So there's no way you can comb the internet for every usage of your intellectual property. AI can. AI can also, so that's how it can really help when it comes to creatives in terms of protecting their intellectual property. It can also help create to some degree, right? A perfect example of copywriting. It's AI is what's behind a lot of the like Grammarly and other software that actually figures out whether it should be an in dash or an M dash. It should be a colon or a semicolon. It can go through and read that. And it can also tighten up your language and these kind of things. That's a good thing. But you have to remember that you may not be able, that in some instances, that may undermine your actual right to protect your intellectual property. So the US Patent and Trademark Office, which and the US Copyright Office have both sort of weighed in on, well, particularly Copyright Office, on intellectual property and I. And the Copyright Office has said explicitly that copyright protections, the right to control how your creative work gets used, only resides in human beings. So if you did a story, if you wrote a story and said, hey, I want to write a story, as I say, about a car crash and the style of Stephen King, you don't have the copyright to that, right? Because even if it's a creative work placed in a tangible format, it has to be done by a human. The fuzzy part is they also said if there's only a de minimis amount of AI content, then it can be protected. The problem with that is what's de minimis, right? It's like you can have a little bit, but how much is what counts as a little bit? And nobody's really sure. So obviously, if you wrote a novel, you wrote a 30,000 page novel, a 30,000 word novel, and you have AI do the proofreading or maybe tighten up the language, but everything else is still yours. Okay, that's not a problem. Of course, you are required to disclose that in your copyright application, right? It can undermine your protection. Similarly, and there are a number of cases about this actually working their way through the court system. If you use prompts, verbal prompts to create a picture, that's not copyrightable. The product of that can't be copyrighted, even though you gave the prompts for what it's supposed to do. You didn't actually do it enough. Now, some people go, how's that any different from a camera? It's just a tool. How is it any different from, say, an Ansel and other thing where you've got like splashes or whatever? And how much human creativity is in that as opposed to, say, gravity, right? Controlling where the paint goes. Copyright office ain't buying it at the moment. So we'll see how that plays out in the court. The other sort of issue is for creatives is as I said, your AI being used to train your IP being used to train AI. And it's unclear at this moment whether or not having having everything from the internet, including copyrighted work, put into into the training data set, whether or not that constitutes a violation of the copyright holder's rights. So there's a lot of it that's really not known now, but it's increasingly something that creatives and entrepreneurs have to think about as they move forward.
Yeah, definitely. I think because the technology is so new, everyone's still trying to figure it out, including the legal system, the
Right.
educational system, especially because back in the day, kids write essays and they can cheat by different ways, right? They go on the internet, they hire someone to write the essay. But now they just go on ChatGPT, they get an essay
Right.
done and they submit it. And how much of that is okay? Because at this point, many universities already allow you to cite AI that, okay, this much was used by AI. And you have to do that just like you're citing another person. And I think with law, it's for me, I see prompt engineering as a human ability. So I feel like these things should be protected because not everyone can create really good prompts and make really cool photos because every single person would be prompting something different. And yeah, and I feel like this would definitely change over the years, especially as more people are doing art in a different way.
Yeah. If you think about it, particularly in an academic setting, it's what happened when calculators came out. I'm old enough, as you can tell by the gray hair and gray beard, all the gray hair, that we didn't even have Xerox machines. They just like little mimeograph machines is how you how you copy things. And when calculators came out, there was a big deal about you weren't allowed to have calculators in class because you should be able to do it by yourself. And then it got to the point where calculators were doing calculations that you could not reasonably be expected to do in the time allotted. And so they were permitted. And calculators have functions that people think are essential. You don't know how to do it, but you need to recognize what the function is, right? You understand the theory, but you don't actually have to do it. I think we're moving that way kind of in AI, but there's one big difference between AI and most other tools, right? Your calculator won't hallucinate. Your calculator won't suddenly go, I don't know the answer. I'm just going to make up something, which AI will do, right? It's crazy, but AI, if it doesn't know the answer, will just make up something. And lawyers have actually gotten in trouble over that, where they've asked, where they've used AI to write a brief they subsequently submitted to court. Now, when you write a document, a brief for court, you're citing cases as precedent. In a number of instances, there were no precedents. That's not unusual. It happens all the time. You're trying to distinguish a case and you're saying, yes, the law says this. This is how the courts generally rule. But my case happened on a Tuesday when the weather was cloudy and there was a gray dog in the street. So that changes everything, right? That's what lawyers do. If the AI couldn't find a case, it just made up one complete with citations and everything else. And a lawyer submitted this to the judge. The judge was not amused. And in one case, a lawyer lost his license. You're not allowed to do that. A human being can't make up stuff. My legal career would have been a lot different if I could just make up stuff and submit it to the courts. Yeah, that's the difference between this tool. The other big difference, of course, is that calculators aren't racist, right? It's the old, as an engineer, GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. And I hate to say this, but the majority of internet content, I would say clearly the majority of internet content is racist or sexist or homophobic or you name it, almost anything you don't agree with, you will find in abundance on the internet. And when that serves to train the AI, you get racist AI. And in fact, early on, they were shutting down large language models for consumer use because they started going off on racist rants. And so that's one of the other issues. Like I said, a calculator isn't going to start talking about burning a cross on someone's front lawn or how wonderful Hitler was, but AI will go off on those rants.
Yeah, I think that's also the thing with the fact that even though there's still AI, that AI came out, there's still a need for humans, right? Because we need to sit there and correct the AI. Because that's what lawyers, I think, well, from my opinion, and like engineers, for example, like when we write programs, like if you can't read code, you're gonna think it's, oh wow, the code came out, it's all correct. But if you have
Right.
an engineer sit there, they're like, oh no, this one fit with this one fit with that. We put this here. And you still need the human to check whether it's not hallucinating, like you say with the legal case, because actually that lawyer was supposed to, hey, let me check this case out. Did it exist? Like Google for 5 minutes and they would have figured it out.
And that's one of the biggest mistakes that anyone using AI can make, and that's not verifying whatever the output is. In any other context, you would verify it. And this goes to a larger issue we have with technology, right? We trust technology more than we should. You're using Google Maps or MapQuest and you're going somewhere and it says make a turn and you're like, that makes no sense. I know for a fact where I'm going in that way. Why is it sending me that way? Most people will just follow it, assuming that there's something they don't know. But sometimes it's just wrong, right?
Yeah,
We need to pull
absolutely.
over and check it.
Yeah, actually, there's been many cases like where people just followed Google Map and just fell into a river. And yeah, I think it's just like how we need to check, right? And we can't trust technology with everything. That's why humans are still valuable for now.
Uh, yeah, for now until Skynet gets up and running. But yeah, that's exactly it.
As someone deeply involved in Detroit's entrepreneurial ecosystem, how have you seen AI impact local businesses and startups, especially in the context of intellectual property?
There are a couple of different ways. So outside of intellectual property, Detroit is a hub for manufacturing and the automobile industry and a lot of just sort of general manufacturing because you not only have the big three making cars, you have every tier one and two suppliers who are making the parts that go into a car. So obviously, a lot of is used in creating a car, but there are a lot of startups around that are manufacturing adjacent that are using AI for things like figuring out the best configuration for an assembly line or figuring out for a production line or figuring out why we're seeing certain why we're seeing certain kinds of injuries, looking at health and safety stuff. So what you have is people looking at using AI to look at long histories of everything from injuries to manufacturing boo-boos to figure out what went wrong in a way that it would just be impractical to have a human do. The other way you're seeing AI used, particularly by startups, is everything from creating a business plan to figuring out, here's a perfect example. If you're trying to figure out what kind of business to start, one of the best things to do is figure out where there's a gap, where there's a need that's not being met. And let's say it's in the healthcare industry. It's almost impossible for you to look at the experience of every single person who has received healthcare services of a particular type and figure out where they found a problem. But AI can do that, even if it was something as simple as going and looking at every review of particular kind of healthcare provider and seeing what the commonality is, which is what AI can do that humans realistically can't. And you say, okay, this is where there's a need. I can create a good or service that fills that need. AI can help you put together a business model. It can help you put together a marketing plan. Just literally every aspect of getting a business up and running can be done with AI in a way that's more, I guess, efficient, though conceivably less creative than a human would do it. But again, you have to factor in the quality of the data that you're getting. So take the example I just used. If you're looking at gaps in healthcare and you're relying on data that's found online, and we're talking about, and a lot of it is frequently open source, it's publicly available information. The data you pull is going to be from people who, one, go to the doctor more frequently under the current system, two, have access to the internet, and three, are the kind of people who go and write reviews, right? But that means that people who don't have access to the internet or who don't do that kind of thing are going to be completely omitted when you start creating your product. And that's particularly important in a place like Detroit, where more than half the population has access to the internet only through their phones. So, because it's a very poor city. So you have to always double check how you're using AI and be cognizant of what the gaps are.
Definitely. I think I really like your example on the healthcare because you're completely right. Not everyone goes on the internet and writes a review about their health. And this also shows that how if you have a certain specialty or an expertise, that person would be able to check if it's correct. Like if it's a doctor looking at the data, they're like, oh, wait, no, but like my patient
Right.
doesn't say this, right? They're like, it's Y, it's not X, right? And I think that's what I'm starting to think that with AI coming on, there's actually more need for experts in their respective fields because they're the people who are able to make sense of this data. Because if I'm going to go do that, I'll probably get something wrong, right? And then build something that absolutely no one wants. And they're like, hey, hey, I didn't have this problem. I just said that because I was having a bad day.
Thank you so much. I am always thrilled when somebody says that AI creates a need for more expertise, not less. Human beings are lazy, and we love the idea of automating things. And so you're exactly right. We think we can use AI to just say, hey, and let it go. But that's not how it works. Or shouldn't happen. Shouldn't be how it works, actually.
Definitely. Can you provide some examples of innovative AI solutions that are currently available or emerging in which entrepreneurs can leverage to protect their trademark and IP?
As I said, AI is more likely to undermine your, for creatives, undermine your um, intellectual property rights than it is to protect them. But it can help you very much identify when others are violating your IP. It can be used as far as protecting it. I think probably in creating it, one of the things that you can certainly do, let's say you're an entrepreneur, you come up with a great slogan or a great trademark, right? You can use, for example, Chatty GPT or something else to come up with Mid-Journey to come up with a visual or whatever. You won't necessarily be able to protect it using copyright because it's not created. However, trademark is different. Trademark is a something. It can be in color, it can be a sound, it can be a picture, it can be a word that is used to indicate the source of goods placed in interstate commerce. Basically, it's just anything to let people know that this is yours. And the more creative and unique and the more it resonates with people, the more likely it is to be remembered. Now, it won't help a crappy product, but it can help a good product compete. So you can use AI to create something. Now, nobody may be able to protect it as far as copyright, but you may be able to protect it as a trademark, which is different, which comes from actual use. So that's important to consider. No, go ahead. I was
No,
just
like
rambling at that point.
because at first I was just like a bit concerned that you can't really protect your AI generated like creative work with copyright. And now that you said that, hey, you can use it with trademark, but I'm a bit confused because I thought trademark was mainly for like logos, etc., for like
It
stuff to do
is.
with your brand. But can you use it for if I made an AI generated image? Can I trademark that?
If you use it to sell something, you would be able to. Just for the picture itself, no. Because as I said, the Copyright Office doesn't grant copyright protection, only grants it to humans. And if a human didn't create it, so you could say maybe you could copyright the prompts, right? And you'd be able to do that. But see, the problem here is this. People could independently come up with the same prompts and the same problem, and even the same prompts won't necessarily produce the same
It's true.
output every time. I think that's going to be something that, I don't see being accepted very soon. I, and part of the reason is the law is structured to preserve creativity as a human thing, right? You can use, you can copyright code, but, and you can use AI to write code. At that point, the code isn't copyrightable. And it's just, it seems very bizarre that you can't use code to create code and protect it because at a certain point, when, if you think about it, code creating code is essentially robots creating robots. And there are all sorts of bad things that happen when you start doing that.
Yeah, actually, I read something about that. It's the fact that people are like, hey, now AI can just generate the code for me. And then they're like, hey, but I copied all my code from the internet anyway from Stack Overflow. So what difference is that? And then I was like, oh my God, that makes sense. It's the same thing. And people are like, hey, you're going to be redundant. But I was copying the whole town because most of the time, no one is reinventing the wheel. If it's already been done, they just use something that can already be used and they just continue out of that. And I think that's a very normal practice in software engineering. So it's strange how we can't copyright AI code when people are copywriting code that they copied from the internet.
It's the same thing for lawyers and firms, but no lawyer drafts an entire contract from scratch.
Yeah,
If I want to do an non-disclosure agreement, I don't sit there and come up with a whole thing from scratch. That'd be absurd, right? So as you do it, you create templates that you use and you update them and all that. But yeah, you're right. It You wonder where's the difference, but as I said, people want to preserve, at least in theory, creativity for human beings. We don't, because we value it, right? We value being able to create something, even if that creation is only, even if that creative input is minimal.
definitely. Yeah. As AI continues to advance, do you see any potential legal or ethical challenges on the horizon that businesses and creatives should prepare for?
Yeah, because it's so new in the United, particularly in the United States. So the EU has already put, just in fact, just recently come to an agreement about how AI can be used. In the United States, we've had our president issued an executive order that imposes some restrictions and requirements on the use of AI by by federal agencies, but doesn't really touch the state and local governments. Right now, the problem is we don't have a fully developed legal framework for dealing with AI, for dealing with its input, what gets used in it, or its output, right? Or how the output impacts others, competing human characters. We don't have real rules for how, for the protections for example, for creatives when it comes to being part of input, right? So there really is no framework that exists at the moment. And it's worrisome for creatives and small businesses. It's even scarier when you think about it for law enforcement. The AI augmented surveillance, predictive policing, they're scary if you really think about it because there are no constitutional guardrails there. The best thing that creatives can do is just simply stay abreast of developments, looking at developments in copyright, looking at thinking about things like using other ways to protect your work. Lawyers have to remember things like if you use, for example, chat, you've got
GPT.
GPT. The problem is that it all gets saved, right? And it's in many, theoretically accessible by anybody. You can completely destroy attorney-client privilege by doing that because you're not protecting it. Same thing for entrepreneurs who are protecting what they have by trade secret. So a trade secret is kind of intellectual property It's different from, say, copyright, trademark, or patent. It's a way of doing something that isn't known to the public. You've developed it yourself and you've taken proper steps to protect it. If you try to refine it using, if you try to refine it, for example, using some online large language model, all you've done is suddenly disclose it to everybody. The ingredients, the recipe for Coca-Cola isn't protected by patent or anything. It's protected by trade secret. And so they have to actually make an effort to keep it protected. Otherwise, it disappears and anybody can use it. Funny story, many years ago, somebody stole the secret recipe to Coca-Cola and tried to sell it to Pepsi. And you know what Pepsi did? They
What?
called up Coke and the police and they said, come get this guy. Because they didn't want to be sued out of existence for stealing trade
Wow.
secrets. You know,
Yeah, that's good.
yeah, that is. You should respect other people's intellectual property.
Definitely. I think that what you were talking about, putting your trade secrets in and having it trained by AI. I think these days, like OpenAI, they came up with uh, this button that you can click and it says that one train it into the AI. Which I mean, we're not sure how much we can believe that, but I feel like it's a bit more safety, especially if you're like working with some crucial business information that you can't solve on your own, like what you said with the health data. And yeah, because sometimes some things these days we have to outsource to AI, but probably not the Coca-Cola trade secret.
Yeah, not and also you have to be careful, for example, about patient medical history, right? Data
Yeah,
privacy protections are
definitely.
really important.
Yeah.
And you go pouring that into AI that you don't control, which is why it makes sense to develop
Mhm.
it in-house. And but even
Mm.
then, many of the times, because the companies creating them want the additional data, even if it's created for in-house, there are many instances where you will find that you have actually allowed them to look at the data anyway. And so you really have to be careful about that. You can end up violating the law, violating someone else's intellectual property just without even really thinking about it. And that's dangerous too.
Definitely, because I've actually had a doctor come on this podcast, and she was doing something about intellectual property and also training patient data for AI, but also having that consent from the patient and ensuring that was done beforehand so that they can enhance healthcare and AI for everyone. So that's actually something that can be done, which is interesting.
Yeah, but think about this, right? Think of the terms of service for your terms of use for anything you've ever done online, for any app, for anything you've ever downloaded. How closely do you read that? Giving consent, it can be tricky because sometimes the truth is you didn't read it. You click it, I do it. And I know what the dangers are, but I'm like, what the heck? I'll click the button because I don't have time to read 30 pages of small 10-point type on my phone. Oh, sure, I'll download Lenza. It happens all the time. So it's a slippery slope, the whole notion of consent. You want to have it, but it has to be real.
Definitely. Preferably, you should force the person to read it and then click the consent button.
That just means they scroll down real fast and then hit the consent button. But you're right.
No, I actually read these things because I'm like,
You
I need to
do?
know. Oh, like when I was opening like my self portfolio, I like it took me like weeks. I was just reading. I was like, oh, like I need to know this. Yeah, I did some
I
law
used to do
courses
that.
in university, so I was like, I need to read this. I'll read everything before I sign it.
Oh my. That is the smart thing to do. But then what happens if you read it and then you're like, I don't agree with that. And so you have a choice between using the service or not. It's the same thing, right? Yeah,
Yeah. Well,
but
it's a
I'm
decision you
impressed.
have to
You're
make.
clearly an engineer.
Thank you. Okay, so we are closing up with our final question. So, for our audience of non-technical founders, what practical steps can they take today to harness the power of AI for protecting their creative works and brands?
The most important thing you can do is always be really cognizant of how much you're doing and how much the AI is doing, right? AI is a tool, right? And it should be used as such. if you are trying to get a copyright, make sure that the amount of AI being disclosed, AI being used is de minimis, right? It can't be very much. And two, keep track of what is being of what's being used. Everything from the prompts that you're using to the kind of AI that you're using, what the data trains that you need to keep track of all that. Also, be very follow this kind of stuff, right? So right now, the things I'm talking about are USPTO decisions. It really hasn't been addressed in U.S. courts yet. So, and there certainly hasn't been any federal legislation on it. So stay abreast of that stuff. And then, of course, remember, you're not the only person involved. So monitor whether or not the people who are working with you are using AI, right? You may well think that a contractor you've hired or a writer that you've hired is writing it. And in truth, they may not be. They may be relying on AI to produce what they give to you, which means that you probably should have in any employment contracts or independent contractor agreements, you should have them warranty that this is an original work. They can't assign a copyright, for example, that they don't own. If you have someone who writes a bit of something for you, or does something for you, you want to make sure that they actually did it so that when you go to register the copyright yourself or go to have the copyright transferred, you can actually make sure that there in fact can be copyright protection. A lot of it just requires paying attention. And the scary part is we think of AI as something that requires us to pay less attention. And maybe in the grand scheme of things, it does, but it certainly changes the things to which we need to be paying attention. And I think it's important that creatives, entrepreneurs, anybody who is using AI, keep that in mind.
Definitely. I really like your advice on keeping track of not only your own usage of AI and where it was used, but also other people who work with us and for us. Because I think,
Mhm.
yeah, that can be really easy to forget because you assume that it's human work, but obviously no one does purely human work anymore. So we're closing up on that note. Thank you so much, Eric, for coming on this podcast.
Hey, my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me. Even if it was before my third cup of coffee.